Okay, let's get into this. We are doing a deep dive today into a really unique collection of sources. It's
Oh,
like a historical time capsule, giving us this incredibly intimate view of a massive global conflict.
it really is.
We're looking at the personal archives, letters, photos, you name it, of a French expatriate family, Jean and Emmy Milo, and their journalist friend, Robert Gillen. And they were in Japan at the exact moment the country just completely transformed.
Right. From this modernizing, almost cosmopolitan nation in the 1920s into a ruthless military empire, and then finally a defeated one in 1945.
And what's so powerful here is that this isn't some dry textbook history.
No, not at all. This is history seen through the eyes of people who called Japan home for 20, incredibly tumultuous decades. Their archives mix high society gossip with the absolute depths of wartime desperation.
Yeah.
It's a human scale story.
Exactly. So our mission today is to synthesize that whole arc. We want to understand how this soaring geopolitical ambition combined with a deep economic collapse and this relentless rise of militarism, how it completely redefined life.
Not just for Japanese citizens, but for these Westerners who were, as you said, caught right in the eye of the storm.
And to do that, we have to start in a very different place. We have to go back to Tokyo, 1927, a city that was just vibrating with modernity and really with hope.
And that modern Tokyo was defined by the start of a new era, the dawn of Showa. You see, Emperor Taisho had just died, and his son, Hirohito, took the throne. He was only 25.
And what's so fascinating looking back with the hindsight we have now is the name he chose for his reign.
Yes, he chose Showa. It literally translates to enlightened peace.
Enlightened peace. I mean, that is just so bitterly ironic given the 15 years of war that were about to unfold. Was that just symbolic? Or did he mean it?
Well, the sources suggest there was a real conviction there, at least at the start. When Hirohito was just 20, he toured Europe, and he saw firsthand
Wow.
the sheer devastation of World War I, the trenches, the shock of it all.
Hmm.
And historians believe that experience really influenced him. He wanted to signal a different path for Japan, a place among modern world powers, not just military ones.
And Tokyo, at that moment, was the physical embodiment of all that aspiration.
Absolutely. It was the epicenter of this cultural and industrial boom, buzzing with Western influence. And not just in business, but in day-to-day culture.
So you're seeing people wearing Western clothes.
Western clothes, flocking to new movie theaters, concert halls, and the city's infrastructure was exploding. Tokyo's first subway line opened that year, 1927, and it was a massive hit. It was a symbol of Japan's embrace of modern tech and efficiency.
And the economic side of that was undeniable.
Oh, completely. Japan was in this period of huge industrial and financial growth. They were actively competing with, and in some areas actually overtaking, the big European powers.
And that dynamism was a magnet for Westerners.
A huge magnet.
Yeah.
The source material says over 1,000 Western settlers came looking for opportunities, and one of them was our main character, Jean Milo.
Jean arrives as a young engineer. He's been commissioned by a big French company to set up this crucial telegraph link between Japan and France.
Right. And his business thrived. He learned the language quickly, really embedded himself, working right alongside the local teams at the communication center in Tomioka.
But he wasn't just there for work, was he? The archives show he was this really sharp observer of everyday life.
His photographs are the key here. They're not the usual tourist snaps of temples and cherry blossoms.
No.
He was documenting the blend of the old and the new. He focused on these little details, like he took photos of peasants wearing coats made of straw from their own rice fields as a kind of traditional raincoat. He was trying to understand the country, not just look at it.
So as Jane is settling in, he's also integrating into this very elite expat social scene.
Mhm. High society receptions were the place to be.
Yeah.
Diplomats, financiers, the whole stylish European colony was there.
And the center of that universe was the legendary Imperial Hotel.
Yes. The French journalist André Valise called it the most incredible hotel in the world. He said it was the undisputed meeting place for the Tokyo elite. It paints this picture of people swapping gossip and talking global affairs over cocktails, feeling sort of untouchable.
And it's in that glittering world that Jean meets Emmy Amura.
Emmy's story is fascinating. She's a 26-year-old Japanese woman who had actually married a Japanese psychiatrist, a Dr. Chitaro Emira, while they were living in Europe.
She follows him back to Japan, but that return home, it turns into this catalyst for her own personal struggle for freedom.
It does, because her husband, as soon as they get back, he inherits the family clinic in Tokyo, and he feels obliged to just snap back into the traditional family system. And for Emmy, who had tasted a bit of independence in Europe, it was a harsh reality. She wrote in her letters that men behaved as absolute masters and wives were seen as mere servants.
What a contrast to the modern Tokyo we were just talking about. The traditional structure is just underneath that shiny Western facade.
Exactly. She said only one thing was expected of her: absolute obedience. She had to live by her mother-in-law's rigid rules, and for her it became rapidly unbearable.
So she does something truly radical for a woman in her position at that time.
She does. She leaves him, she moves to Tokyo to find her own independence, and her personal story really mirrors this wider social movement that was happening, the rise of Japanese feminism, the modern girls, or Moga.
The Moga, they were pushing back in every way they could.
Yes, demanding the right to vote, going to university, working. They were challenging all the conventions, short, boyish haircuts, smoking in public. They were the proof that modernization wasn't just about subways and telegraphs. It was about changing society.
And Emmy finds her way into this circle. Her letters talk about this cultural exchange. She'd lend a friend her Western clothes, and in return, her friend would teach her how to wear a traditional kimono.
She was living this nonconformist life, blending two worlds. And that energy, that determination, is what completely charmed Jean.
He was known for his beaming face and optimistic conversation. They fell in love.
They did. They set up a home in the chic foreigners' quarter, and their life revolved around that expat community. Robert Gillen's writing about the Wednesday lunches at the French embassy gives you a real feel for it.
What did he say?
He said, 30-odd French residents would gather around a huge table for tasty and good-humored meals. And he specifically points out Jean, calling him a very popular guest, a lively and optimistic conversationalist. It's clear that in the late 1920s, the Milos felt completely at home.
And they start a family.
2 sons, Louis and Mark. They split their time between Tokyo and these idyllic holiday spots like Kuzawa and Kakon right at the foot of Mount Fuji. Emmy wrote home that life was sweet and the scenery wonderful, and that the boys feel at home.
It sounds like a perfect bicultural life. But we know, of course, that this couldn't last. Which brings us to our next section, where we start to see the political foundations of that happy life begin to crack.
Exactly. Because if you look at the 1920s, Japan had made these huge progressive steps towards democracy. You had labor unions organizing, and then in 1925, a huge milestone: direct male suffrage for all men over 25.
On the surface, it looks like they're on the right path.
It looks like it. But for every democratic step forward, there was an immediate, brutal step back. The political establishment passed an internal security law designed specifically to silence anti-capitalists, to silence any opponents of the regime.
So control was the priority.
Absolute control. The system could not tolerate dissent, especially after the first socialist representatives were elected, and the government's reaction was terrifyingly fast. March 15, 1928, the political police executed this massive crackdown.
They arrested 1,600 people.
1,600 actual or alleged communists. And they completely disbanded the labor unions. This wasn't a subtle move. It was a clear message that enlightened peace did not extend to anyone who challenged the power structure.
And the human cost of that. I mean, you see it in the story of the writer Kobayashi Takiji.
Yep. A tragic example. He was a young communist writer who dared to condemn the police's brutality in a book. For that, he was jailed and then tortured to death during interrogation.
And his works were banned.
Banned until the very end of the war. That story was deliberately meant to terrorize anyone else into silence.
And then, on top of this political unrest, you get an economic disaster.
Yes. Public trust in the government was already shaky. And then the Great Depression hits Japan in the spring of 1930, just 6 months after the Wall Street crash. And the government was completely unable to handle it.
The result was just catastrophic unemployment.
2 million people out of work, officially. But the real suffering was in the rural areas. The farmers were already struggling, and then silk prices collapsed, which was their main side income.
And the archives showed just how desperate things got.
It's heartbreaking. In the mountains of Nago, families were starving. They started selling their young daughters to tea houses, to work as waitresses or geishas, just to survive. This wasn't abstract economics, this was human catastrophe.
And this is where the military steps in, but not just as a fighting force.
No, as a social solution. For these desperate, impoverished young men, the Army offered something the civilian world couldn't: regular pay and 2 meals a day. It was a guaranteed way out of poverty.
So the military is providing stability, and that means hundreds of thousands of new recruits.
Exactly. which rapidly consolidates the army's power. They're not just gaining soldiers, they're gaining political dominance because of economic desperation.
And this newly powerful military has a very simple solution to Japan's domestic problems.
A classic imperial solution: expansion. They decided the answer to poverty and unemployment at home was to seize new territories and new resources in Asia, expanding the empire that already held Taiwan and Korea.
They decided to wage war to solve their problems at home. And that brings us to the formal start of Japan's 15-year war, their first target, China.
China was the perfect target, already torn apart by its own civil war and dotted with Western concessions. The first major move came in September 1931, the invasion of Manchuria.
And the speed of it was terrifying.
In just 6 months, they controlled a region twice the size of Japan itself.
And they immediately moved to legitimize their control by setting up the puppet state of Manchukuo.
Right. They installed the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, as the leader. But let's be clear, he was a complete figurehead. He took his orders directly from the Japanese army.
The journalist Volis called it the army's fiefdom.
A perfect description. He said the army controlled everything: finances, police, government. They were never going to let it go.
Why would they? The economic benefit was incredible. It provided a direct fix for the depression back home.
It was a godsend for Tokyo. Manchuria delivered a third of Japan's iron ore. It became the world's biggest soybean producer. The resources just flowed back to Japan,
And to lock that down, they launched a huge colonization program.
basically exporting their poverty problem. They relocated 1 million Japanese settlers to Manchukuo to cement their claim.
Now, at first, the West was sort of hesitant to get involved, but this expansionism quickly starts to threaten their own interests in China.
It does. And that concern explodes when the Japanese Navy, acting on its own without even consulting the government, attacks Shanghai and its Western concessions in March 1932.
Andre Volis was there, wasn't he?
He was. And his reports just capture the horror. Violent and bloody street fighting and fires, air raids, bombings. He noted the irony. Japan, once this small kingdom, now dominated the Far East through a series of victorious wars,
And thousands were killed in those international concessions.
which made the West realize the threat was immediate. This wasn't some distant colonial squabble anymore.
So, with their own people hit, they finally act. They broker a ceasefire and back Chiang Kai-shek's government, telling him to condemn the invasion at the League of Nations.
And the international community finally took a stand. March 1933, the League of Nations declares Japan's policy illegal. The vote was a landslide, 42 nations to 2 against Japan.
Japan's response to that condemnation really defined their path forward.
It did. They declared the judgment impossible to accept, and the Japanese delegations famously just stormed out of the League of Nations.
So they chose isolation.
They chose isolation over compliance. They were essentially saying, we reject your world order, and we will pursue our invasions freely, with no oversight from you. That walkout is the moment they pivot from seeking Western approval to aggressively rejecting it.
And once they turn inward, the internal violence just escalates.
Dramatically. Back in Tokyo, the ultra-nationalist military officers didn't need international approval. They just imposed their will through violence. Assassinations of business leaders, politicians, even the prime minister. The army was becoming a state within the state.
And Jean Milo was right in the middle of this when the February 26th coup attempt happened in 1936.
He was working at the Havas agency offices. And this wasn't some small skirmish. It was a full-scale military operation to seize the city center.
Jean actually got a major scoop out of it, didn't it?
He did. He managed to get the news to Paris before it was fully contained. He reported that 1,500 soldiers had occupied Parliament, the War Ministry, police headquarters, all the key strategic locations. The prime minister barely escaped with his life.
And the rebels' goal was to establish a military regime with the emperor as the absolute leader.
Yes, but this is one of those rare moments where Hirohito actually intervenes. He objected firmly. He issued that famous declaration, "Troops were mobilized without our orders. No matter what they are called, they are no longer our troops."
So the coup failed.
It was suppressed. Martial law was declared, 15 officers were executed. But in a great historical irony, the ultras basically won.
How so?
Because the new prime minister, Prince Kano, immediately bowed to the military's influence. He increased the armed forces budget and publicly backed their imperial ambitions.
Yeah.
The country's direction was now set in stone.
And the expats, like Jean and his friends, they're watching all this happen.
With growing fear, they note in their letters that the ultranationalists were openly fascinated by Hitler and that the Führer's influence was becoming much stronger in Tokyo. You could see the alignment with European fascism long before any formal pacts were signed,
It's no wonder Emmy felt the need to escape. She takes that trip to Manchukuo.
which the army had bizarrely tried to turn into a sort of tourist destination.
Right. So there's this incredible disconnect. She's in Harbin, partying with jazz musicians in this liberated social scene.
All happening inside a puppet state built on invasion and exploitation. It just shows how easy it was for some people to normalize the consequences of military power.
But the army's focus soon shifts back to China. The new goal is the capital, Nanjing.
And the invasion is devastatingly fast. Beijing falls in July 1937, Shanghai a few weeks later, and after very fierce fighting, the Japanese army enters Nanjing.
And what happened next? It's one of the darkest moments in this entire story.
It's unbridled brutality. The troops, cut off from supplies, just went on a sustained killing spree, looting, burning the city, and the Japanese high command. They just turned a blind eye.
The accounts are horrific.
Soldiers bayoneting civilians, mass rape on a scale that shocked the world. And no one was spared, not the elderly, not children.
The numbers are staggering. Something like 200,000 citizens killed in just 3 months. And while the international press, like Life magazine, is expressing this profound outrage.
Back home in Japan, there was a total cover-up. The Japanese public was kept completely in the dark about the Nanjing Massacre until the very end of the war.
So what were they being told?
Propaganda. The victory over China was presented as a return to peace, a liberation of Asia. The Asahi Shimbun newspaper ran stories claiming they had laid the foundations for economic prosperity in East Asia. A total fiction.
And back in Tokyo, that propaganda was combined with total national mobilization.
The entire population was drafted into the war effort. Citizens held these huge public fundraisers, handing over money, saucepans, even their personal jewelry.
Were all to be melted down for cannons.
Exactly. A total channeling of personal wealth and sacrifice toward the war.
And this came with severe ideological restrictions.
Complete censorship of the press, the radio, any criticism of imperial ideology was forbidden. Everyone was expected to rally around the government without question.
So the very traditional system that Emmy had escaped in the 20s
Now becomes the mandatory government-sanctioned model for everyone. The Western way of life, with its independence, was now officially frowned upon.
Yet despite all this, the Milo family decides to stay.
It was a difficult choice. Jean's business was there. The kids spoke 3 languages. They felt Japan was their home. And as they said, when they looked at Europe, the situation there seemed no better.
And they were right. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. World War II begins.
For Japan, this is a massive strategic opportunity. The Western powers are now distracted. Their presence in Asia is weakened.
And France, now at war, mobilizes its citizens abroad, including Jean.
Yes, he's ordered to report to the military attaché in Yokohama. But Robert Gillen's writing shows that the whole French community saw this as, in his words, a bit of a farce.
And this anecdote about the Secret Service is just perfect.
It is. The commander, Thibault, gets this absurd telegram from Paris asking for a report on his civilian intelligence service, a service which did not exist.
So he just decides to create one.
Out of thin air. And in the utmost secrecy, he names Jean Milo as its head.
So Jean, the optimist, is now a secret agent.
For about 5 minutes, the whole thing was just so naive.
Wait, they were planning to run a secret service from the embassy, which they knew was bugged.
That's the absurdity of it. And the mission failed in a matter of hours, all thanks to expat gossip. Emmy told her friend Anne Francis, who told someone else.
And Jean lost his secret agent job the very same day.
Because the whole French community knew about it. It's funny, but it just highlights the deadly efficiency of the Japanese Secret Service. They were listening to everything. The archives have their surveillance reports, transcribing conversations from those Wednesday lunches about things as mundane as a new car.
Every move was being recorded.
And then, in May 1940, the devastating news arrives. Nazi Germany has invaded and defeated France. Jean, who was in the Colonial Telegraph Battalion, gets sent to Indochina.
But by the time he lands, France has already surrendered, and the collaborationist Vichy regime is in place.
And France's vulnerability is the exact moment Japan was waiting for. They immediately move on French colonial assets in Asia.
They issue an ultimatum to Vichy.
A non-negotiable one.
Yeah?
Demanding access to northern Indochina, a military mission, and critically, a complete stop to sending any aid to Chiang Kai-shek in China.
And the French governor-general had no choice.
None. The colony was defenseless. They didn't have a single tank. They had to comply.
And Jean's fluency in Japanese suddenly becomes this huge asset.
To the defeated French, yes. He's brought on as an interpreter and liaison officer for the Japanese delegation. So for 2 months, his job is basically to watch and interpret the Japanese takeover of French colonial infrastructure.
His photos from that time are really telling.
Their strategic intelligence. He captions one photo of hundreds of oil drums. Here's a bit of war booty that Shanghai won't be getting. He's documenting the systematic seizure of resources.
And the French admiral in charge, Decoux, he confirms Jean's fears.
Yes, he reports back to Vichy that the Japanese are gathering information of all kinds and that they have other objectives. He knew they were there to stay.
And those objectives were all about resources.
Everything. Indochina's rice and rubber, the oil from Dutch Sumatra and Borneo, British Hong Kong and Singapore, the iron and sugar from the American Philippines. They wanted it all.
And to give this conquest some ideological cover, they announced the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Asia for Asians, under Japanese leadership. It was the propaganda justification for a massive resource grab.
And despite forcing the French into an agreement, the Japanese army just invades anyway.
The very next day,
Yeah.
they cross the border, uninformed French troops try to fight back, and after 3 days of fighting, the Japanese are in control. Jean witnessed an Asian power taking over a Western colonial possession by force. It was a historic moment,
And days later, they signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy.
formalizing the Axis powers. By July 1941, they have 40,000 soldiers in Indochina, turning it into the springboard for their wider Pacific invasion.
Which brings us right to the brink of the Pacific War. The U.S. tries to force negotiations with an oil embargo.
But Japan had already decided on war. They just stalled for time while they finished their preparations.
By the autumn of 1941, Jean is back in Tokyo and life is unrecognizable.
Severe rationing. Rice, miso, sugar, coal for heat, all tightly controlled. Emmy takes the children to their holiday home in Karasawa, 100 kilometers away, just to escape the tension.
And the city is thick with fear. All foreigners are suspected of being spies.
A dozen Frenchmen were detained in December 41 with no proof. And for Emmy, this fear was deeply personal because of what happened to her friend's husband, Jimmy Cox.
The Reuters correspondent.
Yes, he was detained by the military police, the Kempitai, in 1940, and during interrogation, he either jumped or was thrown to his death from a window. Emmy was terrified. She helped his wife Anne collect her things before she was rushed out of the country. They knew the danger was real.
And it wasn't just foreigners. Japanese citizens were under the same level of control.
Kano's government created a single political party and a massive propaganda machine. The doctrine was absolute. Worship the emperor, serve him loyally, night and day, each in his place.
And they used neighborhood associations to enforce this.
To spy on each other, reporting anyone who spoke out against the war. Social control from the ground up.
Even the schools were taken over.
The military rewrote the curriculum. Children were taught to die bravely in the war and to appreciate the beauty of death. The entire nation was ideologically mobilized.
And Jean, separated from his family, the man who was once this beaming face, he becomes terribly lonely.
He rarely goes out, just reads. Sometimes he'd meet Robert Gillen at classical concerts, listening to Beethoven at Debussy, just trying to mentally escape the war.
And then, December 8th, 1941, the news breaks about Pearl Harbor.
Jean observed the reaction. He said people seemed outwardly indifferent, but he believed they were actually stupefied and dismayed. The gravity of attacking the United States must have been immense.
But the initial victories were intoxicating.
Absolutely. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines. Japan won battle after battle. Citizens were thrilled, processing to the Imperial Palace to salute the emperor.
The Japanese officers thought these quick wins would force the Americans to negotiate.
A huge miscalculation. And that delusion was shattered at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. That was the turning point, the end of Japan's supremacy in the Pacific.
From there, it was just defeat after defeat.
The situation became desperate. They started conscripting students. The military invented the kamikaze, the suicide pilot, sending the nation's brightest to their deaths. But it was no match for American industrial might.
And then the war came home. From November 1944, the U.S. began bombing Tokyo.
Heavily bombing the working-class neighborhoods. Jean and Robert witnessed the incendiary night of March 9th, 1945. Hundreds of thousands of bombs raining down on wooden houses.
Incinerating Tokyo.
And Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, with napalm, essentially wiping out Japan's industrial heartland.
And what was the emperor's reaction to seeing his capital in flames?
He viewed the destruction, but he let the military fight until the bitter end. His silence cost millions of lives.
After that big Tokyo raid, the authorities evacuate all the foreigners.
Officially for their protection. But the real reason was to stop them from reporting back on the catastrophic extent of the damage,
And Jean ends up back in Karasawa, the old holiday village.
which was now a high-security internment camp. For neutrals like the Swiss and Axis nationals like Italians and Germans, their freedom was gone.
And Robert Gillen was there too.
He was, and he noted the place was swarming with plainclothes police officers and police spies whose main job was to keep everyone apart.
And for Jean, the personal cost was immense. He gets to his old holiday home.
And it's empty. His marriage hadn't survived the long separation. Emmy had already moved with the children to another neighborhood. The family was permanently broken.
Life in Karasawa was brutal.
Barely survival rations. A small square of black bread and a bit of soy porridge. Hunger was constant.
And Emmy, on her own with the children, she had to resort to the black market.
Selling off her jewelry for food. A black market that was, ironically, run by Japanese profiteers with the police's help. A totally corrupt system preying on the desperate.
And then comes the final fear. News arrives that U.S. troops have landed in Okinawa.
And the people in Karasawa were terrified they'd be massacred by their guards in a final act of desperation. The Swiss ambassador had to plead with Washington to spare the village, which thankfully they did.
The end comes quickly after that. July 27th, 1945, the Allies issue the Potsdam Demand. Unconditional surrender.
But crucially, with no guarantee that the imperial system would be preserved. The Japanese government ignored it. The emperor said nothing.
And the United States decided to display its new, horrifying power.
August 6th, the bomb on Hiroshima.
Yeah.
August 9th, Nagasaki. 2 cities and all the people in them just wiped out.
Gene was devastated. He started cutting out newspaper pictures of Hiroshima and pasting them into his personal albums.
A stark contrast to the idyllic photos from 20 years before. And Robert Gillen just articulated the profound shock of it all. He wrote that the atrocity of war has reached new heights. He said humankind had entered the era of mass murder.
It's that realization that technology had suddenly created this new reality of self-destruction.
It is, and Gillen even warned about the future, that the nuclear fallout made it even more abominable for future generations. He understood the long-term horror of it immediately.
Japan surrendered unconditionally on August 15th. General MacArthur's 8th Army took over, and in this stunning reversal, the Japanese people, exhausted and defeated, started to see the Americans as liberators.
And Gene, the communications expert, was immediately put to work by the new administration, heading the 8th Army's Telecommunication Bureau.
And his sons, Louis and Mark, now teenagers fluent in 3 languages, they were hired as interpreters. They became the bridge between the victors and the defeated.
MacArthur's democratization program moved quickly. In April 1946, they held the first multi-party election since the war. The voting age was lowered, and women voted for the very first time. Everything Emmy and the MOGA had wanted in the 20s was finally happening.
But there was still this huge, unresolved issue, the emperor question.
The Japanese people were divided. Many demanded Hirohito be tried as a war criminal, or at least abdicate.
And MacArthur had to make this choice between moral accountability and pragmatic politics.
And he chose pragmatism. He decided the imperial system was necessary to unite the country. His logic was cold and simple. Destroy him and the nation will disintegrate.
So the emperor was not tried.
He was shielded. The responsibility was laid entirely on the militarists at the Tokyo trial, which ran from 1946 to 1948. And that trial was crucial because it's how the Japanese public finally learned about the full extent of the war crimes. Manchuria, Nanjing, all of it.
But leaving the emperor out of it left this deep, unanswered question in the national psyche.
Perfectly captured in that diary entry from a demobilized soldier, he wrote, "A huge number of human lives have been sacrificed in the emperor's name. He, more than anyone else, must be held responsible."
And the Milo family, our guides through all this, their story just ends with a scattering.
A lack of resolution that mirrors the nation's. Louis became an architect in Paris. Mark became a U.S. Army intelligence officer, trained in Japan for the Korean War, and settled in the States.
Jean moved to Geneva and started a new family. Emmy stayed in Japan until 1952, then settled in Brighton. They rarely sought each other again. They never really spoke of those years.
It's a powerful reminder of how these huge global forces don't just shape history, they shatter individual lives and families.
So we've tracked this incredible 20-year journey, from the sophisticated cocktail parties where Jean and Emmy met to surviving on the black market in Karasawa. We've seen how internal terror grew from a security law, how economic desperation fueled an empire, and how personal lives were just fractured by forces they couldn't control.
And Robert Gillen, who stayed in Japan, maybe best captured the feeling of the people who lived through it. He wrote, "We Japanese smile because we are hurting. A wound, a failure also require a smile. It is our politeness towards fate and our revenge because we make adversity lose face as well."
Wow.
And he concludes, "There are millions of smiles on Japanese faces today because in Japan there are millions of wounded hearts."
And that's the thing. This story really shows that when empires collapse, the decision of who is held accountable is often a cold, pragmatic choice made by the victors, not a moral one.
Which brings us to the final thought for you, the listener. Considering MacArthur's decision about Emperor Hirohito, that choice to preserve a unifying symbol over pursuing full accountability, what long-term impact does that have on a nation's ability to truly deal with the ghosts of his past? Does that pragmatism ultimately help a country rebuild, or does it leave a dangerous, unhealed wound for future generations to navigate?